City Church or North City Church, we want to welcome you here today. Thank you for joining us. And we want to share a little bit more about the story of how we got here today. The reason that we call what we're doing today IMBY, it stands for In My Backyard. What this is about how we can be people who say, yes, we want to share even our backyards with people who are in need. We know that some people have felt like NIMBY or not in my backyard, and that is understandable, but we as Jesus followers are saying, what would it look like to be more open-handed and generous, to be welcoming to people who are in need of a home?
So Northeast is an old neighborhood. It has a lot of old housing stock, and a lot of our original housing in Northeast was really servicing some of the needs of the rail yard, the rail workers. And so we're at this kind of threshold of what the future of housing needs are going to be for a modern city. We have a major housing crisis in Minnesota, in Minneapolis specifically. Our city is growing dramatically. There are so many housing needs that we have, and we just have not kept pace. And so our housing costs are getting really out of hand. It's really unrealistic to be able to afford to buy a home in Northeast Minneapolis. And Northeast used to be a place where you would move because of its affordability. And now our housing stock is old, it's small because it's meeting the needs of a prior generation. And it's very expensive. And so what we need to do is we really need to come up with innovative ways of solving those housing challenges.
So there's a huge housing shortage, as you know. What we're finding is there's a big gap between the kinds of houses that we offer in our community and the kinds of homes that people really need.
Pretty much since Mill City Church started, we have wondered, how is God inviting us to join in with the housing crisis, the affordable housing crisis, and the homelessness crisis that we have in Minnesota? We started to recognize there was this gap in advocating for accessory dwelling units in the Twin Cities. Multiple cities have made it possible legally to have an accessory dwelling unit, but very few cities have made it reasonable yet, because there's all these things that need to come after that to make it reasonable to be able to have the zoning work out exactly correctly, and exactly where can you put all of these things.
So Yard Homes is essentially a housing provider. Yard Homes is offering a range of prefabricated, pre-engineered, pre-designed units, and we offer them in ways that can drive down cost. So we're trying to be a different kind of home provider.
I think one of the things that we need to consider as we think about our housing challenges is the configuration of our families. We used to live in much more intergenerational households. We've atomized our way of life. We're not as connected to our neighbors as much. We're not as connected to our families as much. And one of the things that I'm really excited about when I think about ADUs, as an example, is the possibility that I might be able to move my own mother closer to me. She lives out of state, and there's no way she could ever afford to live in Minneapolis because she retired early to take care of my grandma. I would love for us to even reimagine how we think of our family unit and how connected we can be or should be, and what that potential could look like with new types of housing configurations.
Let's go back and let's think about what was happening in the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We had wave after wave of immigration. We had a lot of newcomers settling in cities. We had overcrowding. We had tenements, and we had safety concerns. While we had a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility, we didn't have the most sanitary conditions, and we didn't have the most safe conditions, especially from a fire safety perspective. So the roots of zoning and building codes were a result of those negative externalities. So let's create some degree of order in our civilization around what gets built where. Let's not allow a toxic chemical factory to be right next to a neighborhood. Maybe those are not compatible things. So that's very well intentioned, and we did a pretty good job of separating those things. But we overlaid over time, especially after World War II, some pretty blatant racist perspectives and some really unfair exclusionary practices. So once the wealthier white folks settled in certain areas and the less affluent, more often people of color, settled in other places, then we started pulling up the ladder. And then we started institutionalizing these separations. Oh, not only is this an appropriate place for housing, and this other place is appropriate for industrial, but let's not create the conditions where somebody with less money can move into that housing district. No. Let's make the lot sizes bigger. Let's create economic barriers. Let's do redlining. Let's create all kinds of other restrictions, deed restrictions. So these things evolved in a very negative way, and unfortunately across almost every city in America.
I left the city of Minneapolis in 2020 and started my consulting firm, and I was just really interested in doing deeper work with local governments around economic development and racial equity, which was really a jumping off point from the Minneapolis 2040 plan, which I led during my tenure with the city. The other thing that really impacted this process was, I think, a recognition that Minneapolis at the time and Minnesota generally had some of the deepest racial disparities in the nation, especially when it came to housing. And between 2010 and 2015, if you were a Black resident of Minneapolis living at or below the poverty level, you had no options for rental housing at that time. There were no units affordable to you in this market. And so there was I think a reality check around that issue and how the city was really starting to price people out in terms of, especially from a workforce standpoint, in terms of people earning minimum wage. I've spent about 25 years in local government, and I've done a lot of economic development work over my career. But I think it wasn't until I talked with Dr. Kristen Delegard at Mapping Prejudice at the University of Minnesota that I realized the strong correlation between land use planning and zoning and regulatory actions on the behalf of local government that impacted housing, and especially housing for people of color. And the intentionality of that regulation was persistent over a period of probably 75 years, starting around 1900. It progressed into what became our modern zoning codes in the 1920s. In the case of Minneapolis, 1927 was the first zoning code. And then it became a federal policy through redlining, which was the practice of limiting mortgage instruments to certain areas of the city that were deemed desirable and not extending mortgage instruments to areas of the city that were deemed dangerous or undesirable. And the correlation there was that typically those areas of the city were populated by people of color. And then in the 1950s and 60s, that kind of came to a head when the Department of Transportation for the federal government utilized the same maps to decide where to build the highways and effectively destroyed most of the neighborhoods of color. The zoning that we implemented in the 1920s has been remarkably durable. And if you look at the impact demographically on the city, you will see that the same neighborhoods that were predominantly white in 1900 are still predominantly white today. So zoning has a much deeper and persistent impact on housing, and especially on housing access for people of color. I think that reversing it will take an equally intentional approach to the approach that we took in the 1920s.
Zoning is something we can tackle, and zoning ultimately is a political decision by the residents of a community. How do we want to live? With whom do we want to live? What environments bring out the best in our communities, in our economies, and what rules reflect our values?
Homeownership has been demonstrated to be one of the most effective ways of building wealth, particularly intergenerational wealth. And homeownership has been systemically excluded from certain communities, particularly the Black community. And redlining still has an impact today. I'm the first homeowner within my family. And that's a pretty profound thing to consider in this modern time, to have those types of impacts still playing out. There's a lot of repair that needs to happen from our past of systemic discrimination. And I think one of the ways that we can help repair that is through creating more opportunities for home ownership.
So if you look at sort of the passage of human history, pardon me for being dramatic, we've had an evolution toward a walking environment in an increasingly urbanized space. And in the US, after World War II, we had a completely different phenomena that was based on the automobile. So unlike most of history, unlike most places around the world, we promoted, through our transportation policy, through our tax policy, through our financial policies, a different kind of lifestyle. So we promoted far rural and suburban living in single-family detached environments with a yard where people are in sort of this box everywhere across America. Prior to World War II, allowed all sorts of different types of construction. After World War II, we became increasingly restrictive. We started excluding people. We thought that we had to somehow protect these suburban enclaves. And we had minimum lot sizes, and we had minimum dwelling sizes, and we didn't want anything other than the single-family homes there. So we created this web of regulation and financial engineering and attitudes that got us to this sprawl environment. In a relatively short period of time, since World War II, we have somehow implied that one thing is normal and other things are not. So we've created this expectation that the single-family home and the nuclear family and the 3 kids and a dog is what everybody's lifestyle is like. Well, that's not the case. And that's increasingly not the case as our community diversifies. A lot of what people want now is different than what people wanted in the 50s and 60s.
There's a cultural norm in the Twin Cities to single-family housing, because that's what, during the last big growth cycle after World War II, that's what we were building here, right? That's what people wanted. But I think people want something different now. And I think it's okay to have a mixture of housing styles.
In this difficult issue, people also can come with their own preconceived notions about how everyone should live. Because I've grown up in a single-family home, I've lived in maybe an apartment for a few years, and I bought my own home, say to people like that. They think that everybody should follow the same path or the same type of housing. And the truth is that many people don't want to live the same housing path that others have grown up in. So we need to be more flexible about the projects we create and who we are serving and meeting their needs where they are.
Building codes are a bit more complicated because we have to consider technology, we have to consider the way building codes work generally across the entire country. That's a bit more difficult.
There's a few regulatory burdens on ADUs that I think are significant. There's a lot of sort of details in terms of the utilities and how those are connected to the dwelling unit. And where the dwelling unit is on the property. And for most lots, those dwelling units are going to be at the rear of the lot. And most of the utilities are going to be in the street. So you can imagine that you're drilling, you're directionally boring or open trenching more than 100 feet for the utility run back to the ADU. So that becomes a serious and significant cost for these projects. I think that people see regulation as a good thing. They see it as some kind of curative, right? But the reality is that most of our cities are overregulated in some fashion.
Cities provide zoning and design standards so that your buildings that you build are very pretty and they're energy efficient and they're all these things. And they're all well-intentioned because everybody wants buildings that are energy efficient. Everybody wants buildings that are designed and look beautiful. But by adding all these layers, you're just adding to the cost of the ability for a developer to come in, create something, and what rents they can charge. Cities have narrowed in their zoning. They've made certain types of housing impossible to build. They've created design standards and city fees and expenses that are very expensive for developers to be able to handle and manage a budget. And if you have very single-family oriented zoning, it's going to be very difficult to switch that later and make it higher density or a different type of zoning that allows for more people to live there. And with many cities essentially zoning out like affordable housing or the ability to do multifamily housing, they're making it just harder on any developer to approach a city and create a project where more housing could be built.
Housing is a major issue for me, and it has impact on me because people are less safe when they're underhoused. We have poorer outcomes for children when people are underhoused or unhoused. And these are all having an impact on our communities. I think creating a coalition for people who want to be involved in the discussion and want to kind of shift the discussion and see better outcomes, I think is a really tangible way for us to tackle this issue. I think a lot of people would say that they are ready to step up and speak to this issue if they had a platform, if they had a kind of an entry point for it. So creating some kind of coalition where people could get involved in that, I think would be really, really helpful.
My hope is that Ward 1 can become the place where anybody can start their life, start their family, afford their home, and live a really good quality of life in Minneapolis. We need all types of housing to address our housing shortage. We need more apartment buildings, we need more duplexes, we need more quadplexes, we need more ADUs.
And so instead of the posture that sometimes comes across to people who are in need or people who are low income, which is, I care about you, but not if you're going to be in my backyard. We don't see that as God's heart. We say we care about you even if that means you're going to be in my backyard, which we don't mean just literally your backyard all the time, but in your neighborhood. And we believe that we can be people who say we want to create more housing for more people in more places so that people don't have to go without a home.